Well, I suppose this was inevitable. I had to eventually make a Nuclear Night video. But I'm actually going to be keeping this one friendly. I'm not going to talk on the porn one. I'm not going to get into, and I will mention them briefly, but things like the fairly discreditable opinion that porn equals rape, as if it's a simple equation of that. I won't get into the whole dudes doing science thing, because would you object if those same statistics were put out by a woman scientist? Just a fair question. And I won't get into the whole life without porn thing. I would argue that life without porn would be, and I know you're probably going to laugh at this, but it would be equivalent to a life without art. They're things that human beings do not need. We don't use them out of necessity, but they help to make a richer experience in our lives. And I'm sure you'll find that debatable. There is a topic that I do want to address, which is the stigma of sex work. You had addressed that you believed that it's right to have a stigma towards sex work, and I just addressed some of the stigma issues, comparing it to the institution of acting and the stigmas that have existed there. The funny thing is there hasn't always been a stigma against sex work. Just as, the actor stigma has been fluid, so is sex work. Various cultures have had sex workers that we don't even have now, or they're very rare. The courtesan type, the ones, and of course this is always for the very rich. I'm not defending that, but that was the society at the time in the Middle Ages and such. It's ironic, actors were being treated like crap, and some courtesans were being treated practically like royalty. But these were educated women. These were women that were often treated much better than any other women in society. And again, I'm not justifying that, but I'm just trying to point out that it's not automatically that they were being seen as disrespectful. All of this whole culture was Christian, generally, in one form or another. And those women were treated very well, and regarded very well, and not simply for their sexual prowess, although that was a factor. It had to do with art. It had to do with being able to talk about topics. They were often very well educated, often politically influential, as should be obvious to anyone. And so it really, it's changed a lot. I mean, if you go back a long ways, and you probably see that there's another picture up. If anybody can guess who that is, that's Ishtar. The goddess Ishtar was worshipped, and often it was tied to what we now know as temple prostitution, or that sort of thing. The term prostitute, as we currently understand it, wouldn't have been used. When you were with a woman like this, you were essentially partaking of the goddess. You were understanding that side of it. It was a religious rite of sorts. So these women were certainly not, basically, it wasn't a $50 thing in the alley, This was a very different sort of thing. But I'm getting to a point anyways. What would a society look like without a stigma? Well, things would obviously have to be very different economically. You would have to have a situation where basically there's no massive inequality of the sorts that we have now between rich and poor. That divide would have to be essentially null and void, to the point where you can't use money as a coercive tactic. In combination with this, you would have to have a society where we are much more open about sex, like even past where Europeans get. It would have to be to the point where, not quite on the bonobo level. If anybody knows what a bonobo chimpanzee is and how they behave, and kudos to them, by the way. They obviously have a lot of fun doing what they're doing, but it would have to be a situation where essentially you cut the supply of said prostitution or sex work. So there's less incentive for men to want to pay for it, because it's more likely to happen otherwise. And this is not getting into a male entitlement issue. It's nothing like that. In such a society where women and men are both so open about sex, women, trust me, would be just as likely to be open and that about sex. I mean, we're talking about, birth control. Is that problem solved? So it's not the old paradigm of, oh, the woman has to be, not promiscuous so she doesn't get pregnant, and the man has to be promiscuous because that's his thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about moving to a new paradigm where women are allowed to be just as horny as men and act on it. And they would. Women have just been taught to hide that. Again, this is a much larger discussion, and I'm glad to be contributing, and I hope it goes somewhere. So you'd have to have the economic issues cleared up. You'd have to have the sexual stigma itself cleared up. And once you have those two things, the stigma of prostitution or sex work itself would essentially disappear. That being said, prostitution or sex work itself wouldn't disappear. There will always be exhibitionists who want to dance naked for people. Actually, I would argue in the society I've just talked about, the open society with no stigma, people would not necessarily do that as an occupation. They would just do it for fun, like we dance now, only they wouldn't wear as much clothing. With pornography or erotica, however you frame it, there's always going to be people who are exhibitionists and want to be filmed and want to have other people see that and enjoy it. And when it comes to prostitution, well, even in an extremely promiscuous society, it would still exist. It would just be more like what I referred to earlier, the courtesan, maybe not in a religious context, but the temple prostitute divested of its mythological undertones. Something where it's almost like a day spa, perhaps. You go and you spend the day, eating well and being pampered and taken care of, and it's all part of, it's basically a much higher end thing. And yeah, it's, again, we can get into discussions about specifics here, but that's what I think a world without the stigma would look like. It would look very different from the world we have today. But it's not that these things would go away, they would just change, because these things have never gone away. And that is actually tying back to the Venus of Willendorf thing in the porn video. Not the porn video you did, I shouldn't say it that way. I don't mean it that way at all. I mean the video discussing porn and science and that. I don't think that she was strictly a goddess figure. I mean, it's hard to tell. 30,000 years old, possibly made by Neanderthals, really hard to say. But I don't think she was just a goddess figure. I don't think it was just an erotic figurine. As with many of these things, it was probably both. So, I've said a lot, I think, and hopefully I've spurred some interesting discussions, and I hope that Nuke responds to this, because I think that'll be very interesting.